Would like to introduce you to Michael Morgan. Hopefully you've had the chance to work with Michael in the past, but if not, here's an introduction. And I'm going to let Michael tell you all about his specialty and what he does. But Michael Morgan has been an instructor for the Upledger Institute for over 22 years and has been the developer and in-buds person for the longevity curriculum for UI. Michael has been instrumental in supporting research on the application of craniosacral therapy to Alzheimer's since early 2000 and has developed classes, webinars, and support materials for the senior population. In 2014, Michael published Prevent Alzheimer's in just 10 minutes a day with the body energy prescription in craniosacral therapy. Most recently, he has hosted the virtual Alzheimer's World Summit gathering 31 experts from around the world to speak on Alzheimer's prevention and treatment. So with that, I thank everyone for having me here with you. Again, I'm going to hand the floor over to Michael. Thanks a lot for being here with us, Michael. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending. And thank you, Justin, for organizing all of this. I'm going to go pretty quickly right now to the share screen and to show my slideshow. So bear with me for just a second. We'll get this set up. Very good. And Justin, I'm going to adjust my view there. Okay, good. And then we're going to do one other thing. Hopefully we'll be on full screen. Good. And Justin, thank you in advance for helping me organize all the slides. Even though I've done it a lot, it's great that great to have your help. And when Justin asked me to do this, it kind of gave me the opportunity to review a lot of what we've been doing in our research over the last 20 or so years, 17 years. I didn't realize sometimes, you know, how happy time passes quickly. I didn't realize I've been at this in terms of research since 2005, even really before that. So in a way, this presentation is a retrospective on how the paradigm for Alzheimer's and dementia treatment has shifted, as well as some of the research which has popped up to kind of help, you know, justify what we're doing and really kind of shed and inform more of what we're doing in our research. And as a result of kind of thinking about this, I identified like 8 key areas of change or concepts that I've seen shift over time. And I know all of you are familiar with Dr. John's work. He did things and he was so prescient, you know, he was so intuitive, even though the technology wasn't at the level it's advanced even in the last 20 years, but it's really in the main really justified and strengthened his views and his incredible intuition. And I think in my own way, in a minor way, that's done that for me because I've started from really looking at where Dr. John started. A lot of you know what I've been doing with the work. And really a lot of it started with Dr. John's research on the immune system. And he created a class called Reversal of the Pathogenic Process. And that was my starting point in looking at what he said about Alzheimer's dementia. It was when Tad was working with Dr. John and doing a lot of illustrations. And Tim Hutton was rewriting the immune system course around that time. So it's kind of like Tim and I started at a certain starting point, and I followed that thread of Alzheimer's. And then Tim deepened that in terms of his insights with the immune system. So there's a lot of parallel work where we've all been kind of reinforcing each other's. So I'm going to talk tonight about 8 key areas of change or concept in some research, and also end with something to dream about. In terms of research, what if we could do it would make things make our case even stronger in terms of the cranial world and treatment of Alzheimer's dementia. So on that note, I'm going to start with concept number 1, you could say. And this is really just the discovery and dissemination of information about the existence of the glial system. And it's funny to say this for those of us that have worked with Tad and have heard about the glial system, but it was only 10 years ago when a lot of this research came out. And in that time when I started, we weren't even really addressing this very much because the technology hadn't existed to do the imaging, the one photon imaging and all that, to look at the very intricacies of the glial system. So when I added this to my starting point and Dr. John's starting point, it's really taking that groundbreaking research and the imagery of the glial system, which has really helped change our perspective, literally, on how the mechanism of cerebrospinal fluid and what we call extracellular fluid has changed. And I just made up this slide myself, and this gives you an overview of what we call the glymphatic system network. I think most of you know glymph means glue and lymphatic because lymphatic system in the brain. And essentially, we see here the periphery where we originally started with a pressure stat model talking about the flow of cerebrospinal fluid in the meningeal system. And all this area of the brain, we knew a lot was going on, certainly. But when we look at the definition of this glial system, we have a system that there's about 100 billion neurons and 100 billion astrocytes. And basically, most of the research in neurology for the last 100 years has been looking at neurons. Now, the hot new area of science is looking at these astrocytes in this glial system, this very complex network. And there's about 1,000 kilometers or 400 miles of vascular supply. So this is a very dense system, and a lot of you know how I joke about things. You can think of the neurons as Christmas tree lights and the astrocytes as the wires that hold them together, loosely speaking. So it's this very complex system that takes cerebrospinal fluid that's on the periphery of the system and allows it to trickle down literally into every nook and cranny of the body, of the brain rather. And when we talk about the Upledger pressure stat model, I know in my own experience, after giving the lecture of the pressure stat model about 100 times, I realized, oh, there's something else that's going on, that this new discovery of the glial system, and all of us as instructors were looking at the time and going, wow, is the glial system complementary to the pressure stat system? What's going on with that? So there was a lot of initial back and forth of us settling into understanding exactly how this works. It seems like ancient history now, but this was a fundamental shift, even in how I started to think about Alzheimer's dementia. And here's a little illustration. Some of you may have seen this. This looks a little bit like radiator fluid, I know, but it's like when you look at this, here's the choroid plexus, you'll see the arachnogranulation bodies, this flow of the periphery of CSF, then you're going to see a pause. And I just added this. This dark blue is just a representation of all of what's called cerebrospinal fluid, which turns into extracellular fluid and flows into every nook and cranny of the brain. So I'm going to just show this little animation one more time. But it gives you kind of a perspective in terms of the brain, how these two systems really kind of interface. So it's following on what Dr. Upledger started, and then it's advancing into what University of Rochester and Nika Nergard in Europe, a lot of researchers, fundamentally did to bring this into perspective. So wanted to share that with you as kind of a first area of something that was pretty fundamental in terms of our understanding and research. The next thing is a shift in research categories in the last 5 years. In 2017 and 2018 at the Upledger Institute, we had about 40 clients and therapists and caregivers from 5 different countries come and did research on people with Alzheimer's dementia and did a bit of a study on that, which Gail Wessler has been helping me coordinate and bring to fruition here for some time. And in the process of doing that, I started to look in terms of when you're publishing research, what the research categories are. And this may sound a little nerdy, but when you go in and you look at research categories, you need an official organization, usually typically a medical college or university, to make sure that the criteria for research is met, especially if you're going to do a clinical trial or study. And I found out in the process of doing that, of course, most of the major research was pharmaceutical in nature. But because from 1995 to 2017, there were no significant breakthroughs in any drugs of a pharmaceutical nature to treat Alzheimer's, it's like other vectors started to come, and other people that were non-pharmaceutical in nature started to say, hey, there's something we'd like to look at too. And they actually, in the research community, created a non-pharmaceutical category, which opened up the avenue for us and other people to start to come in and share what we'd found. So that was pretty exciting as a concept. And that was even in just the last 8 years or so that occurs. So non-pharmaceutical research and a way for us to present this in terms of non-invasive manual therapy is something pretty fundamental. And Gail Wetzel right now is working on even writing something called a white paper that will even justify a manual therapy approach and introduce this to the scientific community and research community, even with greater rigor. So this is part of the shift in research to justify an area that we have been more involved in. And I'm just referencing this today because a lot of you have heard about Dale Bredesen, who wrote a book called The End of Alzheimer's. And kind of Dale Bredesen and myself are two of the people that said, you know, Alzheimer's is even possibly, we could slow the progression and possibly even stop it, maybe even reverse it. This is a bold thing, but he's a functional medicine doctor. And I'm just using this as an example in terms of non-pharmaceutical because this is from his website, and he's created something called RECODE, where he's actually studied several hundred people, and just with strict analysis, blood titers in a very extremely specific way, different than the way most of the analysis is really done with blood work. He's looked and created a very strict dietary approach. And of course, I talk in my book about exercise and diet, and then add craniosacral therapy, which I kind of call the missing piece. And the reason I refer to that is this is very honestly some of the results of his research from adapting what he's doing. And it's found that in the overall hundreds of people that he studied, about 23% saw no change. That's pretty honest. 26% died, but 51% improved. And I'm just thinking in working possibly in collaboration with him, because we're pretty much on the same wavelength, is that if we could add craniosacral therapy to the mix and see if this 51% could be shifted to maybe 60 or 70, that would be significant. And I like the way he's actually kind of coded this because it makes sense to me how it's possible that this could occur. That's pretty honest. It means that we can't help everyone, but 51% is not bad. And I think even in our world, the cranial world, I think at least anecdotally, we've shown at least we can hit those figures, if not beyond it. So think if we could have a synergy and combine, I think that would be very exciting. So in terms of that non-pharmaceutical approach, this is just one example of what is what's possible. And kind of concept number 3, which has been growing, is Alzheimer's is not a one-pill solution, which is kind of a Bredesen. I've been saying that too. That's his own way of saying it. But it's a change in perspective because the pharmaceutical approach has largely just not worked. And I kind of use the analogy, if you've ever heard this, if everyone has a cell phone, you know how you have a cell phone and you hold it up and there's the apps on the cell phone. And if you push it in a certain way, all the apps kind of jiggle. And then when you change it, all the other apps change in relation. That's kind of my analogy for saying when you have a drug and you target one molecule to knock out another molecule, the whole system in relation to everything else shifts as well. And you've got to take that into account. So that's why we're looking, when we're saying Alzheimer's is not a one-pill solution, we've got to look at things holistically and see how the whole system interacts. And on that point, there's a way to think about Alzheimer's not being a one-pill solution. And there's basically, I've come to conclude, so has Bredesen and a lot of other people, more than one factor. So you have to think, as we do as craniosacral therapists, in a more holistic way. So one of the factors is inflammation, which food can be a big part of that. A lot of functional medicine doctors call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. So inflammation in the body, which unfortunately at times can overflow into the brain, we'll say more about that in a minute, that can be a big factor. But as well, it could be atoxic. It could be hormonal in nature. And there could be a hormonal component to memory and dementia. And I, full disclosure, I'll use Alzheimer's and dementia interchangeably in this conversation, even though strictly speaking, Alzheimer's is 65% of all dementia. Okay, but I'm just kind of using it interchangeably for the minute. Then there's another factor, toxic, as in heavy metals and aluminum. You know, because I started by treating a lot of kids, and I still do in children. When you look at autistic kids, toxicity can be a big thing. That's a whole nother subject, right? So, but toxicity can be a piece with memory, all right? Then also there's vascular, as in stroke and a heart attack, deoxygenation of the brain structure, central nervous system, you know, it seems kind of obvious. And then finally, trauma, as in closed head injury or concussions. So concussions has become, in our institute, a whole nother trauma. You know, Gail has a class on concussion. Marianne's developed, Cisco's developed a class. So when you think about concussion and you work on a football player, like when I was involved with the NFL player studies and Ricky Williams, that can be a whole nother piece. And the point of all this is that one size doesn't necessarily fit all. This is something I've come to realize in the last 5 years, is that you can have 50% inflammation, 40% trauma, 10% toxicity, or any combination or percentage thereof. And that makes a difference in the way you approach the treatment from a clinical point of view of a client as well. And listening with your hands, seeing what they have to tell you can inform you quite a bit about what's going on. So that's just been another change in perspective as we've grown in this process and learned more about it. So perspective number 4. Oh, and I'm going to give you a little homework, by the way, full disclosure. So if you can get a piece of paper and a pen, if you happen to have one around, if not, that's fine. But we'll do a little audience participation for a couple of minutes in a minute. So what I'm going to talk about is the Arc of Alzheimer's. And traditionally, when you look at someone who develops Alzheimer's and they go through the process and then they finally pass away, which happens, unfortunately, in many cases, if not all, I was always saying for the longest time, it was about 8 to 12 years. All right. And pretty much when you see these pieces I'm going to talk about down here, it was thought that it was going to be, it was really early, mid, and late stage. And that encompassed the 8 to 12 years. All right. But Bredesen and others, you know, all researchers began to realize the reason they made up the term mild cognitive decline, which has also changed since I started working on this, is that most researchers realized if the disease has progressed to too late a stage, you can't really do much about it. So they thought, well, maybe we could do something earlier. And that's why they kind of coined that term mild cognitive decline. So it's just very interesting to see how the research community has responded to that. That's also changed a lot in the last 10 years. But the idea is Bredesen and others, and I pretty much agree with this, is that the earlier you can catch the development of the disease, and if you have the tools to identify it, then you have a greater opportunity to change the trajectory of the disease. So when you look at this, having said that, you can look at actually 5 different stages, and there's 2 prior stages that we're now talking about that weren't previously discussed. Subjective cognitive decline and asymptomatic. So there's, like, we could say 5 stages which span maybe 20 years. So here's what I'd like you to do for audience participation, if you would. Get a piece of paper, this is very simple, and draw a line. Just draw a horizontal line across the paper. I'll give you a minute if you want to. And then on one end, draw on the left, draw like a little goalpost, and on the right, like a little goalpost, okay? So just like this, if you can see it, just draw a line and then draw, a line on the left and a line on the right. Then on the left, label that on the far left start, and then on the far right, label that finished. So start is on the left and finish is on the right. It's like a timeline, right? Then what I'd like you to do is on this line is make 20 marks that are fairly equal. Don't worry about being perfect artistically, but just make 20 marks on that line, all right? And each one of those marks represent a year from 0 to 20, okay? So do that, just like, draw a line. This is kind of a way to explain this to people too, if they don't understand, to give them an idea of why intervention in an early stage is so important. Hopefully this will be a good graphic if this works for you. So on the left is start and on the right is finish, and then make 20 hash marks. All right. Once you've done that, over on the far right, at around number 18, label that late stage. Just put late. All right. And this is just a generalized, it's not specific and exact, but it's just a generalized way to think about it. So on a mark around 18, put late stage. And then around mark 16, put mid stage. And then around mark 14, put early onset, or we could say mild cognitive decline. But then around mark 12, put subjective cognitive decline, which is harder to peg, but people may notice it even long before there's early onset. I've heard that so many times, I can't tell you. And then around mark 10, put asymptomatic, which means there's no symptoms, but that doesn't mean that something isn't brewing, right? So once you've drawn that mark, then you realize over on the left, there's 10 years where nothing is showing up, one would think. But the point of changing the trajectory, and I have to give credit to one of the presenters that Gail Wetzler had, a lady from UCLA who was an expert in Parkinson's, that kind of started using that word, changing the trajectory. And I heard that and I realized, wow, that's a way that we could shift things. It never occurred to me that changing the trajectory was the way to think about it. So what I've done also on this paper, if you can see it, is in the middle of this timeline, I made a little mark that goes up to represent changing the trajectory. Because left unattended over 20 years, when you get to late stage or beyond, the brain and the body interact in such a way that, what people usually die of from Alzheimer's is respiratory or cardiac distress, and not so much the brain, but it's like there's literally a squeezing of the cerebral cortex, and respiratory and cardiac function are just compromised. It's not a nice way to go. We call it, as I said in my TED talk, a nice, a slow walk to the grave. So, but when you think about the perspective of 20 years, that gives people a little more idea of what early intervention could achieve. All right. So insight or observation number 5, in terms of organizational change in perspective. The American Alzheimer's Association, arguably the best fundraiser, but also the authority on Alzheimer's and at least facts about it, is they've kind of shifted over the last 10 to 12 years from there's no known cure, which is true, strictly speaking. But they've also started to now talk about the idea that they can slow the progression, which is the word they use. And for them, to me, that's a pretty major shift in paradigm that they're even talking about. And I think that can be attributed to a lot of other people doing alternative work saying, maybe there are ways to intervene and at least slow the progression, which for a lot of people would be huge. And I'm taking that honestly a little further to say, not only could we slow the progression, kind of like Bredesen saying, but could we stop it altogether? And maybe even there's a possibility of reversing the change as well. And there's a lot of research now in neurology to say that, well, you know, even nervous tissue in the body can reconstruct itself. That's a whole new cutting edge of science. So the idea is that, and they're acknowledging, American Alzheimer's Association, that even a change in diet and other interventions, of which we can be part of, can make a difference in that. So that's pretty exciting to think about that as a possibility. And it's just interesting to see that organizational change is possible. Sometimes it's not quick, but with enough input from other researchers and resources, it shows that it could be possible. So I've just kind of witnessed that and observed as we've gone through time. Number 6 is neuroinflammation and neuroadaptability. Neuroinflammation is kind of an older term, but the idea of, in my Alzheimer's World Summit, I interviewed Robert Keith Wallace, who's a meditation researcher. And he said, yeah, he says neuroadaptability is a whole nother way that people are beginning to think about the way the nervous system can respond and heal itself. And one of the articles that occurred in 2019 that I actually reread today from Scientific American talked about the role of brain inflammation in Alzheimer's and dementia. And part of what I discussed in my interview with Dale Bredesen is neuroinflammation in the formation of amyloid plaque. And kind of, if you can follow this thread, kind of the idea is that a lot of people say that you can have amyloid plaque, which is a protein that clogs up the brain, but some people can have tons of it and they don't seem to display any problems or memory problems. And there's a famous nun study that I was interviewing, mentioned to him, where they had a whole group of nuns. And when they did the autopsy after they died, they had tons of amyloid plaque, but they were completely functional. So we talked about the idea that if you have neuroinflammation and amyloid plaque together, then that can really be problematic. And he says, yeah, when you have both of those, that's not a good thing. And it's funny because when I started to do the research on this, I realized that part of my model said that neuroinflammation and plaque seem to go together. So this article in Scientific American kind of talked about that. And funnily enough, this was written in 2019, and they referred to the 1918 pandemic. This was just before COVID happened. So they innocently were referring something that was just about to come, and saying that in cases where people in the last century had that, were suffering from that they were much more prone to have memory problems and compromises in the immune system, funnily enough. So there's that thread. And then a very new thing, this is in the last 2 months. I had a client come to me and he was very concerned about microvascular trauma and brain bleed. And you know, in craniosacral therapy and Cranio 1, we talk about TIAs or transient ischemic attacks, and it being an indication for craniosacral therapy, especially when we talk about the parietal techniques. Well, I went and I started looking at the research because this fellow was concerned about, can we do treatment if he has microvascular trauma? And what I found in the research is that about 39% of all people who have Alzheimer's disease also have microbleeds of some sort. And this fellow, when he did his MRI, it was just filled with all these spots of microbleeds. And it gave me another insight into the role of the immune system and microinflammation. So let me see here. Oops, sorry. So what I want to share with you is a bit of my model that I've talked about for the longest time and how all this complements it. And so it's the idea that in the model we've been discussing for some time, in the first stage of Alzheimer's, Tad has done a great job talking about the microglia. They're like the immune system factors embedded within the brain. They're like the local patrolman, if you will. And in our theory about microinflammation or an inflammation in the brain, in stage 1, these microglia are fighting as hard as they can to fight any potential insults. in the brain, maybe that come from outside. And if they're overwhelmed at a certain extent, you know, Tad talks about microglitosis and astroglitosis, then what happens? Well, then this is my analogy from years ago, that sometimes it's like a country inviting another country's army into it to fight. But once that army's in, they may not be able to get rid of it. That's just my analogy I've been using for years. And that is kind of like stage 2, where the immune system factors cross the blood-brain barrier. And these pro-inflammatory cytokines, which have their own secondary and tertiary effects, create their own inflammation, and they aggravate the situation. That's more common in stage 2, where we know there's a problem. Grandpa and grandma, they get lost. Not only do they not lose their keys, but they know they have to do something about it. That's more obvious. But notice that this stage 1, and looking at the trajectory of the development of the disease, that might have been going on for even a decade or more beyond that. And then stage 3, as Dr. Upledger talked about, continued destruction of healthy and unhealthy brain tissue. Some people would talk about this Alzheimer's as almost like an autoimmune disease, where the immune system is so out of control that it attacks itself. And funnily enough, this article in Scientific American that I referred to spoke about that as well. So they're tying together the immune system, microinflammation, and all the rest. And of course, we're also adding the fact that there's a lessening of the flow of cerebral spinal fluid, which doesn't help anything at all. All right. So, Rudolph Tandy, who's a researcher at Harvard that's done, he actually helped identify amyloid plaque originally as one of the key factors in Alzheimer's. And he just says, in terms of the development and early intervention, he says, it's like if you have someone who has full-on Alzheimer's and you want to give them a drug for that, it's like taking someone that's had a heart attack and suggesting they take Lipitor or something. It's like, that's something they should have done 10 years ago. So he's just present to that. When I gave a presentation last year at American Society of Aging, I used that quote because it's very prescient. You know, what he says, like, about looking at the timeline, looking also at the process of inflammation. So there is a study that I'm referring to as far as microbleeds. Let me see if this comes up. I'm going off the reservation here. Yeah. So dementia, neurodegenerative disorders, characteristics of cerebral microbleeds. I'll send you the reference for this if you want. But it's this whole article talking about 39% of people who have Alzheimer's that have the microbleeds. And it's just very interesting to look at this as another causative factor in this whole sequence of things. So one other point about this, in my model, this is a slide that Tad made for me, and this is the neurovascular unit. The people of University of Rochester talk about this as well. So here's your glial cell astrocyte. This is your neuron, and this is your capillary here, about 400 miles of these. And in this light yellow is this perivascular space. So tying this together with the microbleeds, what I realized in the last couple of months is that kind of drawing on my model of the immune system crossing the blood-brain barrier and coming in and trying to help, quote unquote, where there's a foreign intruder. What happens in this perivascular space when there's a development of the disease process? This is something that other researchers are kind of looking at and confirming in a way. They're saying that, look, what can happen is that there's a lessening of cerebral spinal fluid. When these astrocytes get inflamed, they swell up and get bigger, and this space gets smaller. And then when there's more immune system factors and macrophages from the outside coming in, this gets to be a pretty cramped space full of a lot of proteins and immune system factors and inflammation and a lot of swelling at a micro level. This is like 20 to 40 nanometers. That's like 25 million an inch. I mean, this is very, very micro. But when you think about this in terms of brain bleed and microvascular intrusion, and this may not happen in all cases, but in a certain percentage of cases, this seems to be another mechanism. What can happen is that this space gets so full, think of it like a balloon. And then when the balloon gets so big, it finally pops. And that popping is what is imaged as a microbleed. And that was my revelation about that. So I'm very excited about this right now. And of course, if you could increase the flow of cerebrospinal fluid through a still point or something like that in craniosacral therapy and get better fluid exchange, you're going to be able to clear these perivascular spaces out, which is so simple. How could we have missed it? But that's one of the missing pieces in the research that we're talking to a lot of conferences about, just to tie all these pieces together, if that makes sense. All right, so number 7, sleep in CSF. This is interesting. This came out in the last couple of years, and the role of the lymphatic system, which we've known about for a while, in clearing toxins from the brain during sleep, and how CSF encourages the beneficial clearing of toxins from the brain. So the way that a lot of people talk about it, Tim has been talking about this for quite a while, and so has Tad. It's the idea that during sleep, this lymphatic system does 60% of its work during sleep. It's clearing toxins, almost like the garbage truck comes out and clears things away. So one of the studies that came out from Laura Lewis at the Boston University College of Engineering, she looked at oscillations of CSF inflow in the brain and noticed that when people went into deeper levels of sleep, about every 20 seconds or so, it kind of sent a signal, and the vascular flow would lessen, but it would invite in a wave of CSF or cerebral spinal fluid. And I'm going to show you a link to an article, and the internet is cooperating tonight. I'm going to scroll down because I'm going to show you this little image. Hopefully you can all see this, I hope. Let me know.
Michael, right now we're just seeing your PowerPoint.
Oh, because what do I have to do to show you this? What do I have to do to show you this image? I have to go out of PowerPoint for a minute. And when I share screen, let's see if I can do this. Share sound, optimize for video clip. Let's see if this does the trick. Can you?
Yep, I do see the web browser there, Michael.
Okay, good. I'm gonna wait till my guy starts spinning. I can cancel that. Okay, can you see that?
It's just still the web browser. Oh, we see the Iowa on air operating room. Okay, I see you scrolling down now on the browser.
There it is. You see that image?
Oh, yep.
Okay, good. Well, you never know with the technology. Anyway, so this is an image of the study, and it shows the brain in these oscillations. And here, around here is the choroid plexus. This is the blue cerebrospinal fluid, and here's the red. And it shows a pulsation. And I don't know if you can see this illustration, really convincingly, but basically what it shows in the red and yellow is how there's waves of CSF that are flowing in to the brain, and this exchange between CSF and the vascular flow. So this is a little animation they've had. This has been on the website. This has been on the web for quite a while now. Can you see that, Justin? If not, I'll move on, but yeah, okay.
Oh, no, yeah, we can see it.
Okay.
It's very clear, yep.
All right, okay, good. So I'm gonna come back to the PowerPoint here. You never know with links what they're gonna do. All right. And then the last thing I wanted to share, and I want to thank Marianne Cisco for telling me about this. I did not know this. There was a study in 2019 on rats where they did still points on rats. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard me right.
Michael, I hate to interrupt you right there, but we are not seeing the PowerPoint now. We're still on the original link, so you might want to just stop share and reshare real quick.
Yeah, okay, stop share and reshare. Sorry, no problem.
You're good.
Okay, can you see it now?
Yep, back to number 8 in the PowerPoint. Yep.
Good. Thank you. This is why it's so good to have a facilitator. They're worth their weight in gold. So number 8 is they did a study, as I mentioned, Marianne told me about this. A group of osteopaths did a study on doing still points on rats and they found improvement in the glial response. This is crazy. So it's from the osteopathic cranial manipulative medicine on an aged rat model of Alzheimer's disease, published in the Journal of the American Osteopathic Association in October 2019. So this is fairly recent. And apparently, because rats age faster, there are older rats that display Alzheimer's disease, or they can. And they did a test on these rats, and they did a still point before and after, and they could tell by the way the rats navigate a maze. They actually have a way, an algorithm to say, okay, the rats can run a maze or not, and from that they can extrapolate how well their memory is working. And here we go. How do you do still point on a rat? Very carefully. You put on your gloves, right? And that's what they did. They did a still point on the rat with these little gloves. And what they did is they did neuroscans and biochemical analysis before and after, all right? And what they found is they studied the rats they did a still point on. I think they compared them with the rats that didn't. So what they found is that after they did the still point over a period of time, and then they looked at their behavior and realized they had an improvement in memory, then they looked at scans again, like MRI or PET scans, to look at the neural activity. And then after the rats died, or they sacrificed the rat, they did a dissection. And what they found is that not only was there an improvement in this glial system in the rats, but actually there was an increase in certain neural factors. And so this is an illustration as well. You may have seen Tad talk about in his course. There's something, this is the meningeal system, and the interface between the meningeal system and the glial system is called an aquaforin. These are like one-way little valves. And this takes cerebrospinal fluid and turns it into a derivative of cerebrospinal fluid called extracellular fluid. Well, they found in the rats that not only were the astrocytes or aquaforins working better, but there was more of them. So that kind of refers to this aspect of neuroadaptability. I would have been happy they were working more efficiently, but no, they actually found there was an increase. Somehow, the rat system on doing a still point, that's the inference, that's an inference, that, you know, there was actually an increase in the number of these glial system factors. So I find that to be fascinating. Like, who knew that was something? And I'm not sure if they looked at my original study in 2008 or others, but somehow these osteopaths, I think they were up in Canada, did this research. And that's pretty exciting. So finally, something to dream about. This has been an ongoing process. You know, it's not a marathon. It's not a sprint. You know, it's a marathon. One of the things we'd like to look at in the future, we've been able to document fairly clearly that there's a less flow of cerebrospinal fluid as people age, and in Alzheimer's even more so. That's been fairly well documented from a number of factors. Also, we know that the amyloid plaque seems to act as almost like a sponge, and it absorbs cerebrospinal fluid, which might contribute to why there's even less of it. One of the things we'd like to establish, and I've been wanting to talk to Thomas Rasputin about this forever, is that if we could do an MRI, and I know not everyone's thrilled with doing it this way, but in real time do a still point and show that there's a change in fluid exchange in the cerebrospinal fluid. We know there is anecdotally. And if we could take a group of people, maybe 30 people, and another 30 as a control group, there's a way to image the amyloid plaque. It's a metallic factor, so you can look at what is called the amyloid load. And if we could take a series of people, maybe 30 people that we did the still point on, 30 people control, and they would do something different, and do that for 6 months, and then re-image them. And if we could demonstrate there was a lessening of amyloid load in those factors, I think that would be very, very significant. So that's one of the things we'd like to dream about. That can be a little pricey because it might be $5,000 to $10,000 to do each MRI times 60, do the math. But that's just something somebody may want to pursue in the future. So I'm ending that with something to dream about. So those are just some thoughts of research and concepts that have shifted as I've been doing this. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to discuss. So I'll hand it back over to you, Justin.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Michael. So I'll go ahead and let's go ahead and just take questions if there are any in the chat. We'll give just a minute or two. I did open it up. We have about a few minutes and a couple other things to cover, but if there are any questions, feel free to. In the meantime, while we're doing that, I'm going to go back into my PowerPoint here, and I do want to talk, had some questions from the chat about Michael's book here. You should be seeing with my PowerPoint, Prevent Alzheimer's in Just 10 Minutes a Day with the Body Energy Prescription of CranioSacral Therapy. We do have that available for you. I'm going to ask Michael to talk about the book a little bit, and also the DVD, Your Health, the Nation, and the Senior Healthcare System. Michael, do you mind talking about that a little bit? I'm going to get you back spotlight
Sure.
in here. You could just tell a little, and then we'll go to the questions in the chat as well if we have some.
Yeah, somewhere in 2012, 2015, I started to write the book. And I really wrote the book for insurance companies to get a justification of what we're doing in this area. That's what it was really for, which has been an ongoing process. And I basically just lay out all the different factors of Alzheimer's, the way that craniosacral works, metabolic processes, all the basic science, so that somebody who's a layperson can read it, but also someone that has a scientific background can kind of appreciate the basic factors. And I keep updating. I'm probably going to write a sequel at some point when I get to it. And then, these, if you want this, order this now, because we have a limited amount left, and they're going to be out of print. It's called Your Health, the Nation, and the Senior Healthcare System. And I interviewed people like Suzanne Skurlock, Tim Hutton, other experts in the area of Alzheimer's dementia, and I did an hour-long video. And it kind of shows, little did I know I was going to do a summit years later, but it kind of shows in a video 1-hour format how that works. So they bundle both these together, and they're very complementary as well. And that's called Your Health, the Nation, and the Senior Healthcare System. That was a lot of fun to do it, because I met, that helped us in our ongoing research, just, writing that in the book itself. So that's a little background on the book. And a lot of people in the cranial world have had it, but it's a good background. I use it as kind of a resource for people that want to take my longevity advanced class as well.
All right, and it looks like, Michael, if you look in the chat there is one question, and then
Okay.
If you see is a diagnosis of microvascular disease involved with the microvascular intrusion you have discussed here?
Usually there is some diagnosis. You have to image it to see it. Okay. And I was looking at this guy's scan when we talked about this. So it can be a diagnosis to show up. It would show up on the brain scans. And I actually think in a lot of cases that if they did the imaging, they would find it more frequently than they realize, if that helps. So you don't have to have, you can get a diagnosis and you can image, but a lot of people may not even realize it's a factor. And it's not a factor in all cases, but what fascinated me about it is I was talking about inflammation and the immune system and a clogging up of this perivascular space. And when you think about it and put it together, it's obvious. Once you think about it, it's like, oh, if this space is full, it explodes and it creates this. But I don't think it always does. But in some cases it does. So it's just another factor which gives us kind of a little bit of a tool to look for things that we hadn't thought about before. I don't know if that helps, but that's kind of like where I'm in this process in the last couple of months of researching this and thinking about it.
All right.
Oh yeah, I see them.
Okay, you see him. Go ahead. Yeah,
Yeah.
we got a couple more minutes here for sure.
Yeah. Can you relate to this to clients who come in after an auto accident with post-trauma inflammation? Yeah, you could. And I've known people, like sometimes they had swells so much, sometimes they have to open things up to let out the pressure. But I've known people that are just, their head feels inflamed and really full. And yeah, still points should be able to clear that, although there might be an acute stage where you have to maybe not work on the head so much, but maybe below the neck, just out of an abundance of caution, I would say. But yeah, hopefully that inflammation after a trauma or an auto accident is going to die down, but there might be some lingering effects, which is why we always say as cranial therapists, can we treat you for past trauma, because the body may hang on to that and remember it. Yeah. In a clinical setting, what would we look for? Tim does this, and I teach people to arc, if you're familiar with the concept of arcing, for inflammatory pockets. And they will feel like, when you arc, like spots in the head, but they can feel like hot spots. So that might be one thing you can do. And it may not show up. There may not be inflammation, but that's a smoking gun. If you have it, definitely that's something you want to treat using direction of energy and other techniques that I talk about in some of the advanced courses. What kinds of early asymptomatic diagnoses are available outside of a research protocol? Let me see if I understand that and can frame that in the way, Diane, the way you're asking. They mean asymptomatic, it's like COVID. It may not show up, but at least with COVID, you can do a test and it can show that the virus is there, right? In Alzheimer's, it's interesting. When you go back and think about year 1 out of 20, it can look very asymptomatic. But I think the point that Bredesen is making is that, you know, I don't know how many people I've interviewed, especially in the last year, that are somewhere on the spectrum, so to speak, of Alzheimer's. And they'll say, yeah, mom or dad now are in the early stage or in the mid stage. And I'll say, did you ever notice anything even before maybe? And they go, well, you know, come to think of it, maybe 5 or 8 years ago, dad had an accident or something happened, or I just noticed something slipped. And that is a behavioral way from the outside of saying something that's going on in the neurology. So here's the beauty of craniosacral therapy. What we found is that if you can listen to the cranial rhythm, there may be characteristics of the cranial rhythm that shows something that's a little disruptive as well. Like the newest thing, this is just from Parkinson's, and we haven't done as much work on Parkinson's as Alzheimer's, but I think there's an exciting potential. But with Parkinson's, that area, not of the cerebral cortex, more the substantia nigra in the base of the brain, is compromised. And when you listen to the cranial rhythm, from a neurological point of view, what happens often with Parkinson's, there's like a palsy, you know, there's like a shaking, right? And I've just recently discovered, is because I'm looking at it, that if you look at the cerebral spinal fluid, and the flow of the craniosacral rhythm, it may not have a smooth, kind of unfettered kind of amplitude and symmetry. It may feel like it's a little interrupted. So in a way, and something I'm just still inquiring on and looking at, in a way, the smoothness or flow of the craniosacral rhythm may actually reflect neurologically whether the nerve impulses in the whole body are being transmitted easily or not. So it's kind of showing the craniosacral rhythm is kind of mirroring the nervous system smoothness or not as well. And like in Tad's class, when he talks about working on the periphery of the nervous system, there's a little bit in the way you can listen to that as well that's reflected. So that's a little bit off in terms of asymptomatic, but I'm just still thinking of ways that we can, using our cranial listening, to show more about that. Certainly, the earlier we can catch it, the better. We can look at genetic factors, which are not a death sentence, but they could be a factor. We can look at lifestyle choices. But the cranial rhythm, just looking for anything, which is what we go into more in my advanced classes, when we listen more deeply, we might see things show up that we're not aware of otherwise. And that's kind of been on, this is all ongoing research in terms of us looking at that. What comments could you make about Chiarias and Chiari malformation? Is that what you mean, Kathy? Okay. So Chiari malformation is more like, when the tonsils at the bottom of the foramen magnum get pulled down. So it's not related so much to memory problems, but in my experience with folks that have had that, they can be pretty on edge depending on the level of the Chiari malformation, whether it's a level 1 to level 4, I think there is. So they can be a little more on edge. So they're going to have a higher sympathetic tone. They're going to be more stressed. That's not going to help their memory. So that one is just like that one requires a little bit of nuance in treatment, just being respectful and listening, because people are dealing with something that if it's a more serious case, they just have to be more cautious about. We can treat that with CranioSacral, of course, because we're non-invasive, but we want to be careful about that as well. And there are some contraindications around that. Seizures due to trauma cause a higher chance of Alzheimer's. I would say they certainly don't help things, okay? They may not be a one-to-one correspondence, but the seizures, if you go deeper into the core of what's causing them, that might belie more of a neurological disruption that also represents a problem with Alzheimer's. So it's like, you got to listen to the seizure and go, okay, what's causing them? Is it physiological? Is it structural? What's even happening on the neuronal level? And you want to kind of look at that as well. So that's what I would do. I'd go like, okay, let's listen to the nervous system and find out what the history is and what else is going on. So that could be a factor as well.
All right, Michael, there was one other question. We'll take one other question
Okay.
here.
All right.
Directly to me. Can you clarify what the amyloid plaque, about the amyloid plaque? Where does the plaque form in the brain? And is it the result of inflammation?
Those are three really good questions. And that's part of where we started our research. So amyloid plaque, there's something called amyloid precursor protein. Try to keep this short. And Dr. Upledger talked about it. It's all over the body. But what happens is when the plaque becomes problematic and it becomes beta or tau amyloid, the bad guys, there's an enzyme called secretase. And I have an illustration of like a little pair of scissors, and it clips this long chain molecule into a shorter, which is beta, amyl, and tau. And that's the problematic plaque, all right? And my theory is that, yes, inflammation causes more of an acceleration of the plaque to be formed. But other people, and I write about this in my book, other people have the theory that inflammation is independent of that. So you can look at it a couple of different ways, to be honest. But I'm saying inflammation, if it's there, it's probably going to create an environment where plaque formation is more likely. I think Bredesen would agree with that, and I think Tandy would agree with that as well. But this is still fluid. There's no absolute 1, 2, 3 answers to that. It's still speculation, but that's just my kind of clinical observation as well. So, yeah, it maybe not even doesn't have to be there for memory problems, but usually amyloid plaque is definitely the smoking gun. And the takeaway to this is when you have inflammation and plaque both, definitely you want to do something to intervene and take it out. And you want to avoid the danger that has not yet come, as an old spiritual saying goes.
All right, terrific, Michael. That was wonderful.